Good afternoon and welcome to Theology Thursday.
Today we are talking about a really difficult topic, but one that we have to talk about. We started having some of this conversation a couple weeks ago when we talked about lynching, and we were drawing on the work of Dr. James Cone in The Cross and the Lynching Tree. But we know that that was just the start of a conversation. And so today we continue to wrestle with the sins of racism and white supremacy. So a couple things that I want to say before we start having this conversation. First, we are works in progress. And, I know that I get really nervous talking about this because I'm like, I'm going to say something wrong. I'm going to be wrong. And guess what? That's probably true. That's probably going to happen. But that doesn't negate our responsibility to have conversation around issues of race and white supremacy, especially as white faith leaders. We have a responsibility to wrestle with this. And so we invite you, if there's questions or comments that you have along the way, please feel free to put them in the comment thread. Or if something we say, raises a question for you, but you don't want to put it on the comment thread, please feel free to message
it to
later.
us, and I'll even try to keep my messages open, so I'll try and field them. It's not a promise, but I'm going to try my best.
So if there's something that, you want to ask, but you don't necessarily want to publicly ask, you want to have a more anonymous way of doing it, we'll see, but we will not communicate who is asking the question. And part of the reason is too, we especially, other white people, other white Christians, don't feel like, and you probably shouldn't, call up your Black friend every time you have a question about racism or is this good or is this bad? Because guess what? They're already bearing a whole lot of emotional baggage. And they are not the ones responsible for teaching us about these things. We can take responsibility for our own learning and our own actions. And so that's part of what we're at least trying to do for ourselves, and help those of you who want to know what you can do to combat racism and white supremacy in our society, but also within our own hearts. So that's why we're talking about this, even though it's really hard and we're going to mess up and say stuff wrong. And we're not there yet ourselves.
And one of the first things, actually before that, how about we start with a word of prayer?
That would be a wonderful thing.
Lord, there are real emotions and real things that often cloud our judgment and get in the way of an important discussion. So, Lord, calm our hearts and our minds. Help us not to rush to judgment, because often we are accustomed to doing that. Lord, open our hearts that they may break, and break our hearts that they may be healed, because you are the great healer. And the way that this world is right now, it is broken and it needs your healing. But Lord, before it can be healed, our hearts must break first. So Lord, open our eyes, that we may see the sins of the world, not turning from them, but instead confessing them. Because Lord, a confessed sin is a forgiven sin. Be with us this day. Bless our lips, because they are quivering at times because we're not sure what to say. But Lord, just help us to point out the sin of white supremacy, which absolutely exists, and help us to find something new through you. Amen.
Amen.
So, one of the first things, and this is actually something we talked a couple weeks ago about, so forgive me if this is repeating myself for the sake of it. It's not for the sake of it. Perception matters. And how we perceive things absolutely matters. And a couple of weeks ago, I told you about a time that Cindy went to pick up food, And as she came back with the food and seemed very rattled, and I was just confused because I thought it was just a simple food pickup. And she had mentioned that she had been harassed walking past a restaurant to the restaurant we were going, or the food
where
was
I was picking food up from. Yeah.
And that there were some individuals that absolutely just harassed her. And for me, that's never happened to me. And it's never happened to a woman when I was with them. So my entire framework, my entire perception was based around the idea that this didn't exist. And so when I hear this story, I was shocked. The fact that we have a marriage and a deep relationship meant that I trusted her immediately. But sometimes when we hear stories that we're shocked about, we don't trust. We're hesitant. We think things might be blown out of proportion. And this is one of the first ways that I think our judgment is often clouded when it comes to issues of race, because our experience is one that we've not experienced it. If you're white, we have not experienced it at all the same way as those with different skin tones. And this is something that our perception, it affects how we interact with things immensely. And so we need to talk to people and ask their experiences that they're willing to share, and listen diligently, and not try and justify things just to hear what the pain is. Because where the pain is, I mean, there is sin at its heart, at its root, and we need to listen before we can act. And so that imagery still sticks with me. I mean, that was sexism, but
it was an experience that I had that you were like, wait, what? That happens?
Mm-hmm.
I've never seen that, but I'm like, yeah, I mean, it hadn't happened to me in a long while, but when it happened again, I was just like, I felt unsafe. I remember walking, kind of quickly, making sure I had my hand on my keys and like walking quickly towards my car because I was really uncomfortable, and they were being pretty like belligerent, and they had been drinking. I was scared. Not like terrified, but I was definitely on edge. That's an experience I've had that Derek has never had, and he will probably never have, and will probably never see. I mean, there's a high likelihood Derek will never see something like that happening. But just because he never sees it and it's never happened to him doesn't mean it hasn't happened to me or someone else. And the same thing is true when it comes to issues of race and microaggressions. Just because we might not see things happen doesn't mean they don't happen. Now, we are entering into a time where more and more things are being caught on camera.
Yep.
But for every instance of violence that occurs against a Black person, think how many more are happening that are never caught on camera and that others might never actually see. And so it's important for us to listen, as Derek said, to voices of Black people. And just again, to go back to what I said in the beginning, this does not mean run up to your Black friend or coworker and say, please tell me everything that's happened to you. If they want to share with you what has happened to them, accept that as a gift, but do not expect or demand that they, be your educator. There's plenty of books and authors and social media accounts and all kinds of stuff where you can learn and you can hear the stories if you do a little work yourself. And I'll share some resources. We'll share some resources later on to help you learn and to do some of this work for yourself, as we've been continuing to try to do for ourselves as well.
And this is always going to be an ongoing process, because just as soon as we get to work on one thing and maybe there is some progress that is made, there are other ways where we often fail to see other brokenness, parts of brokenness that exist. So this is going to be a lifelong process, and this will never cease as long as there's breath in my lungs. And so that being said, one of the first ways that white supremacy manifests is through experience and through blindness, like what I just named. It's really tough to identify a problem when you've never seen it. I've heard someone say in conversation, haven't things been getting better? Because from certain perspectives, from certain individuals in this nation, things have progressed. They have gotten better. But just because my experience might only perceive things getting better, which that's not the case for me, but just because my experience, my perception is only one way doesn't mean it is that way. And so we need to listen diligently. And there's been a lot to listen to this past week.
Yes.
So starting off, there have been two very key incidents that happened in quick succession. And in the fact that they happened both in quick succession, I think is profound insofar as one points to the other, and how they point to one another was actually very, very shocking.
Yes.
But this is something that has existed for a long time, and many people had perceived it, but I hadn't perceived it, and other people hadn't perceived it. And that's the thing is, like, I'm not saying that's good that I hadn't perceived it, but now that I see it, it's like, oh my gosh, we can do better than what this is.
So let's name those two incidents in quick succession. So the first one, they've both been all over the news. The first one occurred in Minneapolis, where George Floyd was a Black man who was killed by a police officer. I believe that, they were trying to arrest him for a forgery or something that was taking place, and he resisted arrest. And the cop kneeled on his neck for, 6 or 8 minutes. And you could hear him pleading, saying, I can't breathe. That sounds a lot like something that happened a few years back to a man named Eric Garner. But he was saying over and over again, he couldn't breathe. He couldn't breathe. Please help. I need some water. I can't breathe. They're going to kill me. And they did. It is devastating and jarring that is something that has happened to a human being.
And it would be one thing if it happened in a vacuum. It'd be a tragedy, but it'd be a single tragedy, a single one-time thing. This has not been a one-time thing. This is why it's systemic. This is why it's so much deeper. I've heard people say that, police violence happens regardless of race. And I will admit flat out that often police violence can be socioeconomic as well. People that are perceived of lower classes are often treated with more violence than people of higher classes. So I'm not saying that there aren't deeper issues here. There absolutely are. But the statistics line up that an exceptional amount of force is used in cases of non-whites. And that's not okay. And what that often is that's perception of going into a situation. And I think it's sometimes how we've been trained as a society to perceive what a threat is, because anyone that's in law enforcement's told that, if you're feeling threatened, you need to take care of yourself. You matter as well. And that's good training. But the issue is that our society tells us that some people are to be more feared than others, that some people are greater threats than others. And some of this subtle, sinister, awful racism that exists is that one person is less threatening than another, all based on the pigment of skin.
Mm-hmm. And so I want to talk about the second incident that happened. And this was in New York in Central Park. And Christian Cooper, he was there.
He was a bird
He was
watcher.
a bird watcher.
My best friend, David Johnston, is an avid bird watcher. Trying to get me into it. I'm enjoying it a little bit. But there is definitely a code with bird watchers that you can't watch birds if dogs are off their leash. And so bird watchers are actually some of the ones that enforce leash laws most of all, because for them to do what they're doing to watch birds, dogs running around disrupts any chance of that. And so Amy Cooper had a dog off a leash in an area called the Bramble in Central Park. And the Bramble has a rule, because it's a place of avid bird watchers often go there. You are not to have a dog off the leash in the Bramble. And she did. And so Christian Cooper asked her, like bird watchers have before. David Johnston shared, he's asked people with dogs to put their dogs on the leash like they're supposed to. But when he did that, she reacted in a way that was downright awful. More than awful. It was on the surface level, she might be able to justify it, but at the heart of it, it was rather sinister.
Yeah. And she said, well, I'm not a racist, but she knew exactly what she was doing when she called the police and started even speaking in a different voice. And well, there is a history of white women's tears and fears being catalysts in violence against Black men. And I think she knew that, and she knew if she really played up the victim that the cops were, that they were going to believe her, because she knew that she had privilege, and she knew what she was doing. And it's easy for me to want to dismiss her and be like, not all white women are like that, but that becomes dangerous because that distances me from Amy Cooper. And the reality is that we all, every single one of us, are implicated in the sins of racism and white supremacy. And Susan Morgan brings up Emmett Till. Exactly. The lynching of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old Black boy, was because a white woman said that he whistled at her and said maybe like, hey, baby, or something like that. And that led a 14-year-old Black boy to be killed, to be dumped in a river. I mean, absolutely. Yeah. Bill mentioned it. Bill mentioned Emmett Till.
And Susan was going to the extent of what the crime was for George Floyd. And it was possibly, and he was never convicted by a jury of his peers. So he was innocent until proven guilty, by the way, because that's America. He was killed because he committed a crime and was perceived as a threat, and the crime was one that did not require violence.
Yeah. Well, and here's the thing, and I think we talked about this when we talked about lynching. Like, it doesn't matter if there was a crime being committed. I mean, if there was a crime, kneeling on a man and basically like crushing his windpipe, that is not a proportional response in any way to any crime, especially in a country where, as Derek said, we are all supposed to be given a fair trial. Now, a conversation about our judicial system would be a whole other conversation, but we're supposed to.
And the other issue is that this was not a solo police officer without backup. I get situations where a police officer is perceived being threatened and does not have the means of containing somebody. I get that there are awful things that happen in an experience that I can't even wrap my head around. But we're talking about there were 4 police officers total. Yeah, I'll admit George might have been a bigger guy, but 4 trained law enforcement officers with probably pepper spray, probably tasers one of them probably has a taser, batons. I mean, there are things, and I'm not saying that these other options would be good to use for the sake of using them, but if something went awry, if he was making a run for it or attacking them, they had the means of doing things to subdue him. So the fact that a knee had to be placed on one's neck to the point of not being able to breathe and eventually dying from those injuries, that's awful. That's murder, or at the very least, that's manslaughter. And this is just ridiculous. And he wasn't resisting. From everything that was shown, he wasn't resisting. And this individual was using excessive force at this point to the point of death. And I want to say, Bill, this is just one of those things that, like, yeah, we're talking about it now because it's popped up again. And the reason why we're talking about it now is because this is an issue that needs brought up. But this is such a subtle thing in general. We have these flashpoints that aren't subtle. But this sin of white supremacy is so subtle, and it's ongoing. And
it's pervasive. I mean, it is pervasive. And it's so easy when we think about, like, the blatant signs of white supremacy that we can somehow separate ourselves out from that. But really, we can't. And there's a graphic that we have that I think is helpful for thinking about this. So I'm going to try to pull that up. Here we go. Okay. All right, so I'm going to try to zoom in on some of this. So we have this pyramid here of white supremacy. And at the top, we have the blatantly obvious things, the blatant obvious white supremacist acts. We have lynching, hate crimes, people wearing blackface, using the N-word, neo-Nazis, swastikas, burning crosses, racist jokes, racial slurs, organizations like the KKK.
Marching in the streets with tiki torches saying that, like, Jews are awful. Things like that are that's the white supremacy in this country that in general is not acceptable. Though it's funny how some demonstrations get tear gas and other demonstrations don't. So
those things that we just read, those are the very top of the pyramid. But then look at all of the things that are below it. And we're not going to look at all of these, but I do want to point out some of them. So just below this line, calling the police on Black people, just like Amy Cooper did. White silence. Here's one that I definitely want to make mention of: color blindness. A common thing that I hear is, I don't see color. I'm colorblind. And I think for many people that comes from a place of good intention, like, it doesn't matter, what color people's skin are. I don't see color.
I'd liken that to, it was a very intentional strategy. It was perceived as a good practice for a while, much like letting blood was perceived as a good healing practice around the turn of when the US became a country. Letting blood was a healing thing. It's what doctors would use to heal, except we found out letting blood doesn't actually heal things. And in fact, it led to the death of George Washington. And so too, color blindness was perceived as a means of healing. But as time has gone on, we've come to realize it heals nothing. And in fact, it leads to the problem even more greatly in some ways. And so just because something is perceived as healing at one time
Yeah.
does not mean that it is actually healing and continues to be.
Well, and one of the real issues, I've been slowly making my way through a book called Raising White Kids, which is basically how can I, as a parent, from my child at a young age, how can I help him be anti-racist? And one of the things they talk about with colorblindness is if you're colorblind, then you are actually not seeing people and where they are in their lived experiences. Like you're writing off skin tone as in reality, in the way things work in our world today, it does put people on an equal footing because racism is still present in our society. And so to say we're colorblind means we're actually completely ignoring the reality and the lived experience of many people. So Bill just said, "What do you do at a stoplight?" And I'm not sure I understand.
I don't know. It's what you do at a stoplight matters. It's a life and death thing. When we get pulled over, I can argue. I can say, "Hey, you didn't get this right." And by the way, I once did that because I actually do believe genuinely that I did not run a red light, but I was perceived as running a red light. And so what did I do when I got pulled over? I started protesting it. But that can be perceived as a threat. And if society has said that I'm more threatening than someone else, then it could lead to greater awful response, excessive force, and possibly death. And so what one does in each place where law enforcement is often goes to show some subtle and some not so subtle societal reinforcement. Why can a white person scream in the face of a police officer, but then someone else just even...
So some of the other thing, I mean, there's just so many. And Katie, I see you asking, where is the pyramid from?
Nadia Bowles-Weber was the one that I saw reposted this.
It's been shared around in a number of places. I will post it on the comment thread after we're done here. But some of the other things on here, and I have to admit, this is one that I have to be super careful of in myself, is the white savior complex. Especially as a pastor, as a faith leader, as I am engaged in the work of trying to learn and be anti-racist, because I'm in a position of teaching and leading others, it's really, really easy for me to default to this idea, like, if I can be a part of this conversation, then I will fix the problem. And that is deeply problematic in a whole host of ways that are related to colonial, paternalistic attitudes. That is one that I see in myself.
Absolutely.
And it's a struggle. So I wanted to point that one out.
And Susan's asking about the word biopic. What biopic means. It's been used at least three times. And I'm not aware of that right now. And so I don't feel comfortable speaking on it because I'm not quite sure what that means. But
Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Okay. I was thinking it was I was thinking the I was Indigenous, so thank you for bringing that up so I could actually check that to make sure that I was in the right ballpark. Like, which shows this is a learning process for all of us. Other things that are on this pyramid, the school to prison pipeline. Mass incarceration.
So a school to prison pipeline, let's talk of that for a second. And mass incarceration comes immediately with it. So I think it was around September 11th, they started putting police in schools as a means of protecting kids from outsiders, which unfortunately has proven that rarely does it work. And I believe it was the Parkland shooting. the threat was so overwhelming that even the officer on site did not feel like on their own they could handle the situation. And so that was the intention, though. But what has actually led to is, as teachers perceive things in school to be threatening, because if you've ever been in a school, or I mean, there are times where kids buck the trend and maybe raise their voices and things get out of hand. I remember many fights in junior high between many individuals. That happens. But what ends up happening with now having a police officer in the building is that the police officer can now be called, and what would normally be an in-house suspension or detention now becomes a crime. And so the school to prison pipeline is where kids that should be punished with in-school punishment, and traditionally, historically, that was the case, they have now been immediately put into juvenile detention facilities, or in the case of certain crimes, if the crime is perceived as an adult-only crime, they'll waive whatever age it is. If the crime is bad enough, they'll say that even if you're under the age of 18, you're tried as an adult, which is an injustice on its own, because if you can't vote in this country, you're not an adult. But anyway, this is one of those ways where kids that have some issues and we don't even know what their home life is like, end up finding themselves in the system at an early age, and they spend the rest of their lives in and out of the system. Statistically speaking, that's often the case. And it all began with good intentions of having a police officer in the schools to protect our children.
Yeah. So I just want to look at a couple more. You can take all of the time you need to look at this pyramid, but higher infant and maternity mortality rates for people of color, Black Indigenous people of color.
And that can also be seen in COVID-19 treating right out the gate.
Absolutely.
The first cluster we had in the state of West Virginia was in the Black community up near Clarksburg, I believe it was. And it was spreading very quickly because there was an event, a celebratory event, that it got spread through, but they were not being taken seriously. Their concerns were being dismissed. And often that's the case. That leads to that.
So again, I just want to name a few more. And honestly, I think the ones that I'm going to start naming are ones that I either at some point have thought myself, or that I see within my own experience. One of those, denial of white privilege, which for a long time I was like, I didn't know that was a thing. I didn't get it. Some that are more down towards.
Can we talk about white privilege?
Yeah, I want to come back to. Because these are related. Down here at the bottom, but we're all one big human family. There's only one human race. Or we're in a post-racial society. And all of those, I think, are related to denial of white privilege or lack of understanding of white privilege. So that's, I think, a topic that we want to spend a little bit of time thinking on now. I'm going to close the pyramid for now, but I think Derek may have linked it in the comments.
Yes, I did.
So you can continue to look at that if you'd like to.
Before we delve into white privilege, one of the questions that really blew my mind, when we both went to Duke Divinity School, and one of the requirements for graduation at Duke Divinity School is a Black Church Studies class. And I'll admit, I, at the time, just saw it as another thing that I had to do to graduate. And that class was a real struggle for me. But I remember my professor talking about down the road, many people would come back to him and thank him for how much of an impact the class had on them throughout their ministry. And flat out, I want to say that next time I see Dr. Willie Jennings, I want to be saying those exact words to him. I really struggled with this class. They really stepped on my toes because they were pointing out some things that I was blind to. And his teaching was absolutely astounding, and I am incredibly grateful. But one of the things that in that class that was brought up is the history of where race even came from. And we've inherited a tradition that comes through the through colonialism. So this is right around when the New World was discovered. There were two groups of people that were seen as less than. You had the savages of the New World, Native Americans, indigenous people, and they were seen as unchristian, non-Christian. And so since they were not Christian, they could not hold land. John Locke later said in the English philosophy on it, it was the Spanish and the Portuguese that had the theology, if you're not Christian, you can't hold land. The English said you can't hold land unless you work the land. And so if you graze off the land versus cultivate the land, you can own it if you cultivate it. This is another way that Eurocentric rules favored Eurocentric approaches. You can say that if you made up your own game with kids and said, well, if you're at least 5'4", you get to have you get to score the first goal. Well, if you're playing with a bunch of 9-year-olds, you're leading a group of kids and no one's that height, then that means that the person that's instructing always gets to score a goal first. That's unfair. That's not right. That's not good. And so too, these rules were set up so the automatic winners right out the gate were going to be white folks, Europeans. And that's how we dealt with the indigenous, the Native Americans. But at the same time, we were importing countless millions or thousands, hundreds of thousands. I think it got to the millions as well of slaves from Africa. And we were also enslaving and shipping out Native Americans as well down to the Caribbean. It was this awful trade where it wasn't just one, it was anyone that was perceived as non-white, because whites were seen as superior. And this tradition is one that we've inherited. Though we might reject the theology, though we might reject the philosophy, the rules that we've inherited still exist. And so John Locke's second treatise on government is the basis, one of the key philosophical arguments for the basis of the U.S. Constitution. I think a lot of his philosophy makes a lot of sense, but we cannot say that this philosophy does not inherently have white privilege in it for those that have always played by the rules and families that have been taught what those rules are and how to play by those rules.
Yeah. One thing that I do want to say about the idea, about the reality of white privileges, I know in past conversations in person, on Facebook, I've gotten a lot of pushback from people around here who say like, but I don't believe white privilege exists because I grew up poor. I have struggled because I have been poor. I haven't, I've had things denied to me. I haven't had opportunities. And in fact, I've been denied opportunities. I've had people specifically criticizing, affirmative action, saying I didn't get something because they gave it to somebody else. And so, a lot of people really struggle with this idea of white privilege, especially poor white folk.
And this is a key thing, and this is something that's happened especially since Reconstruction following the Civil War. Right after the Civil War, poor whites and poor blacks actually worked together and started voting in people that represented them, whether it be poor black freed slaves or whether it be poor white farmers in the South. They started voting them in. And what ended up happening is those people in power saw that this group was about to take over the democracy, the Republic of America. And so what they did was they started pitting one against the other. And it's real easy to take two groups that are lacking resources when you have all the resources.
Right.
And then say,
like, oh, they took your cookie.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like you're sitting on a box of cookies and there's a single cookie on the table. and say like they're trying to steal your cookie, even though you have, hundreds of cookies in your hand. And that perception is a very real thing. And there is, without a doubt, poor whites in this country absolutely struggle. Absolutely. And in these hills that we call home in Appalachia, there has been oppression and colonialism in an entirely different way. And it is sinister and it is awful. And I would even go to the point to argue that how some coal companies practice economic injustice, it turned into a form of slavery. By no means was it anywhere near as explicit or just awful as chattel slavery, but when you entirely control the economics of a person's life by giving them fake money and constantly putting them in debt, I would argue that is a form of slavery.
Yeah. Well, and so, white privilege, almost every single person lives on some, a spectrum of privilege and not privilege. White privilege is the idea that that doesn't mean you're privileged in all areas of your life. You might not have economic privilege, but it means that the color of your skin has not been a hindrance. Other things may have been a hindrance, but the color of your skin has not been one of them.
So when you buy flesh-colored Band-Aids, for instance, do they match the flesh that you have? That's a really subtle one, but that's a real one. And there are things like this that absolutely are just seen throughout our culture that are subtle.
Yeah. And Bill just shared that as a pastor, there are churches that have locked him out of consideration to be their pastor because of the color of his skin. That kind of stuff is still happening. It's still very present and real.
And that absolutely breaks my heart because I had the honor and privilege in the summer of 2008 to work with Bill. And oh my gosh, one of the most amazing, Bill, it was such an honor. You're one of the most amazing people. You're a amazing theologian and you live out your theology each and every day. And it is just amazing and it is powerful. And it was such an honor. And I can see God's call in your life. And those that you serve, those congregations you served, are blessed by your presence beyond a shadow of a doubt. And those that have turned you away, I'll pray for them, because anytime you decline a blessing, you've actually accepted a curse. And unfortunately, with them declining your blessing, they've really missed out on some great opportunities to listen to what the Holy Spirit's doing.
Yep.
And we can play Xbox again.
Yes. So, our conversation has gone in multiple directions, and we have not even touched on the Bible and ways in which the Bible has been misused and abused, or also the ways in which the Bible calls us to live and to act. So that's probably going to have to be saved for another conversation on another day. In
a nutshell, a couple things. These Truths by Jill Lepore. She's a white woman that teaches, a professor at Harvard, not just teaches. She's a PhD. Wonderful book about U.S. history, and she does not shy away. She will tell the story of what happens that we often hear in the history book, but she'll also speak at the same time of those that aren't winning simultaneously. So it's about those that are that liberty and whatnot is working for them, but it's also about the indigenous Native Americans, as well as the those that have come to this country enslaved with little choice. And it also includes those that were in indentured servitude, but that is not the same thing as chattel slavery. And one is bad, the other is absolutely far more sinister.
Yeah. So one of the things that I want to do quickly is share a couple of good starting places. We realize the irony of the fact that we're two white people trying to talk about race. And so really we're talking to fellow white people, especially fellow white Christians, when we're sharing these things. But at the beginning, he said it is extremely important to listen, to follow, to allow people, to Black, Indigenous, people of color, to lead us. And so I want to share a couple of links. I'll post them in the comments after we're done, but I just want to show them to you now. The first one is anti-racism resources for white people. It is a Google Doc that was compiled just this month. And I'll zoom in a little bit here, so hopefully you can see it. But basically here, there is a collection of resources for white parents to raise anti-racist children, articles to read, videos to watch, podcasts to listen to, books to read. We have a few of these in this list here at home that we're slowly working through.
And the bishop actually just recommended that I read the New Jim Crow,
which we have.
The 13th on Netflix came out in the last couple of years, and I mean many folks have Netflix, and that's on there. So
there's a number of things that are listed on Netflix. So if reading a book or articles, I realize that we don't always have a lot of bandwidth right now. And so if film and TV is something that will help you learn, use that. If you've got Netflix, use it. There's also a lot of organizations to follow on various social media platforms. And then at the bottom, there's projects, more resources to read, listen to, learn from.
And that first one on that list, 75 Things White People Can Do for Racial Justice, that one has been passed around a lot. It's actually from 2017, but it asks some really, really important questions about things that can be done. And this is
and you are responsible for your own learning, your own education, your own listening. This is not something that anybody else can do for you. You are going to have to do the work yourself. The other thing that I want to share, and this is a pretty helpful PDF. I found it helpful, and I shared it a few weeks ago on Facebook. Opportunities for white people in the fight for racial justice, moving from actor to ally to accomplice. And I'm not going to read this for you, but ultimately what we want to get to is a place of being an accomplice in the battle to dismantle racism and white supremacy. And this document also gives some really good and specific ways that you can work on that shift from actor to ally to accomplice. And I will say one really great way for you to help right now is to pay attention to local organizations like the CARE Coalition, support their work. They're doing lots of important things. Black Lives Matter, West Virginia, there's a Black Lives Matter chapter here. Support those organizations. Listen and learn from them. And there are all kinds of ways that we can become active and continue to grow in this work. So again, I will put both of these links in the comment section so you can find them and look at them at your own pace. There's so much good information out there. And
it can be overwhelming. So what we'll do is we'll also link just a handful of articles that really have stood out to us as well. They might speak to you, they might not speak to you. The rest of the list is fantastic. Please use this list. But I know sometimes someone will hand me something and be like, here's a bunch of stuff to read. And it's like, it's so overwhelming, you don't know where to start. So we'll give you a couple that we really that helped us, and hopefully they help you as well.
Yeah, and what was I just going to say? I don't know what I was going to say. What I was going to say. If there's anything on here that you see or read or that you're struggling or wrestling with, feel free to message us. We're happy to talk about those things. Like I said, we are by no means experts. This is just stuff that we have personally really been wrestling with as individuals, but also as church leaders. Yeah, The New Jim Crow, absolutely such an important book by Michelle Alexander. It's hefty, but it's an important read. This conversation has got to continue, and of course, it has to move beyond conversation to action. We saw a friend of ours posted as he was reflecting on what happened, the killing of George Floyd. He was realizing, the only thing that might have prevented that might have been a white person hurling their body in the midst to intervene.
That was David Johnston.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I mean what he was saying at that point is acknowledging that that one could very well die. That person that was hurling their own body could very well die, but this is the call of a Christian to take up one's cross, to lay down one's life.
Right.
And it is the part we don't like to talk about.
Yeah. Yeah. And so this conversation is just like barely scratching the surface of what we as people of faith are called to do and called to be.
But this topic is so important because literally lives are at risk. I've had several friends post that are raising young boys that are seen as cute, young, and they talk about how there will be a day where they will be perceived as a threat. And raising a little boy who just so happens to be white, I don't have to think about those things, and that's not fair. That is not right. That is unjust, and that needs to change.
Yeah, and Brenda mentions her friend whose son was taught be respectful of authority, and but to be stopped for no reason, and to know especially what has happened to so many other Black men, and I don't want to leave Black women out of this conversation too, because there's just so many instances in our society, like countless. But it's bigger. It's so much bigger than what exists in my heart, what exists in your heart, what exists in your heart. Like when scripture talks about the powers and the principalities, I think one of the powers and sinister principalities of this world is racism and white supremacy. It is demonic. It is bigger than just the sin in our hearts. It is something that has taken root in the very ways in which we live.
And what we watch and who we read is a prime example of the supremacy we live into. And it's something that most published authors, white men, white women, we have to go out of our way, and we shouldn't have to go out of our way, by the way, but we need to be intentional about, are we actually letting our lives reflect what we're saying when we say the phrase, "I'm not racist," which, by the way, I don't think anyone can say, because there is always a little bit of prejudice, even in the most saintly person's heart. And that's something that we will always have to dismantle from now until we meet Christ, whether he comes in glory or we meet him face to face.
And I think it's also a fallacy to think racism is just something that exists in our hearts. Like, we participate in systems that are racist.
Yep.
And so we can't just say, well, I'm not racist, unless we are like a hermit living in a hole and we don't have any interaction with society. But even then, we might still be, because we are failing our responsibility, or we're hiding from our responsibility to love our neighbor. So yeah, okay, maybe we can't at all. We can't. So
that's the sin is always a moving target.
Yep.
And regardless of what the sin is, and it is always something.
Yep.
So
thank you for hanging with us through this conversation that we don't entirely know how to have, but we're going to keep trying because we have to. We need to. It is our sacred duty and responsibility to love God and to love our neighbor.
And to love our neighbor means have compassion, which literally means
suffer with.
Yep.
So, well, thank you guys for joining us today. Like I said, I'll post those resources and the links here in just a minute. We'll continue to have this conversation in the coming days and weeks. Feel free to message us.
Yeah. Thank you, guys.
Thanks. Oh.